Major funding for this program provided by the Ford Foundation, a resource for innovative people and institutions worldwide. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding provided by these funders. There is no question that individual human beings are different, one from the other. Our eyes confirm this day in and day out. Skin color, body shape, hair form, eye shape. For several hundred years, we have used these visual differences to classify people into 4 or 5 groups we call races.
We have a notion of race as being divisions among people that are deep, that are essential, that are somehow biological or even genetic, and that are unchanging, that these are clear-cut, distinct categories of people.
And the beauty of the race business is that you can identify people by just looking at them. You don't even have to look at their genes because one manifestation of their genes is there, namely skin color or eye shape or hair shape. And then that's the key to everything.
The idea of race assumes that simple external differences, rooted in biology, are linked to other, more complex internal differences, like athletic ability, musical aptitude, intelligence. This belief is based on the idea that race is biologically real.
All of our genetics now is telling us that that's not the case. We can't find any genetic markers that are in everybody of a particular race and in nobody of some other race. We can't find any genetic markers that define race.
And actually, what we're going to generate are billions of copies of a little section of your genetic code. And we're going to look
These students are gathering for a DNA workshop led by Cold Spring Harbor Labs teacher Scott Bronson.
And pipette up 30 microliters, fill it to
Marcus, Gorgeous, Jackie, Noah, Hannah, Jamil, and their fellow students are about to explore the biology of human variation.
But there's another type of DNA. Does anybody know what that type of DNA is? Yeah.
Mitochondrial?
Mitochondrial DNA. Very good.
They will compare their skin colors.
They're like not human colors.
They will type their blood. And they will swab cells from inside their mouths to extract a small portion of their own DNA. Once the sample is ready, they will compare some of their genetic similarities and differences.
We're going to look at a very tiny section of this ring.
The students begin the workshop with the same assumptions most of us have.
As you begin to look at the data, you might want to keep in your mind who you think you might be most similar to and who you think you might be most different to.
I think I probably have the most similarities with Mr. Bronson or with Carol. Because we were white males, both Kirill and I and both Scott Bronson and I.
I think I'd have the most differences with Kirill and the most similarities with Gorgeous.
She's African-American, I'm African-American. I mean, like, black.
I think maybe me and Natalia are most alike.
She's Latin American and I'm Latin American. I figured that there would be tons of differences, especially with people who looked so different.
Type 2,
to understand why the idea of race is a biological myth requires a major paradigm shift, an absolute paradigm shift, a shift in perspective. And for me, it's like seeing, what it must have been like to understand that the world isn't flat. And perhaps I can invite you to a mountaintop, and you can look out the window and at the horizon and see, oh, what I thought was flat, I can see a curve in now. That the world is much more complicated. In fact, that race is not based on biology, but race is rather an idea that we ascribe to biology.
The idea of race as biology is ferociously persistent on America's playing fields. Gorgeous Harper and her teammates are competing at the Adidas Nationals.
I love to run track. I've been running track since I was 8 years old. The people I train with, they all want to be the best, and you got to put in the hard work.
This is the top event for elite high school track and field stars. And while racial differences are not necessarily discussed openly, they are often part of the careful calculation of competitive edge.
Well, I've heard some rumors I've heard are just like blacks have an extra muscle in their leg, but I don't think anything's true.
I assume that a white girl can't beat me in the 200. In my mind, I don't think she can beat me, but I won't sleep on her.
I don't want to get too controversial here since I really don't know exactly, but I'd say that there's maybe a little bit that, not to use as an excuse as why they beat me sometimes, but maybe considering when you look at the Olympics, you know, who tends to dominate the 100, the 200, and the quarter for the most part. I just have to say the way it all falls out tends to point to what your race is.
I'm really saying that different populations, whether it's West African descended blacks, and that's what African Americans trace their ancestry to West Africa, or East Africans, or whites or Asians, they all have different body types and different physiological structures that allow them to have advantages in one sport or another. There are, as a genetic basis for these kinds of differences. Through culture, environment, training, athletes can't dramatically change the limits of what they can be.
I would like to say to John, there is no scientific definition that holds up about race. Race has changed its definition in this country to the benefit of those who wanted to define it differently. And there is no scientific place to start from, so you have no basis for your work.
And underway here, section.
We can see differences among populations, but can populations be bundled into what we call races? How many races would there be? 5? 55? Who decides? And how different would they really be from one another?
The measured amount of genetic variation in the human population is extremely small. And that's something that people need to wrap themselves around, that genetically we really aren't very different.
In fact, genetically, we are among the most similar of all species. Only 1 out of every 1,000 nucleotides that make up our genetic code is different, one individual from another. These look-alike penguins have twice the amount of genetic difference, one from the other, than humans. And these fruit flies? 10 times more difference. Any 2 fruit flies may be as different genetically from each other as a human is from a chimpanzee. So the central question for us is, of the small amount of variation between us, what, if any, is mapped along what we think of as racial lines? Because we live in a racialized society, this is not an academic question. We have a long history of searching for racial differences and attributing performance and behavior to them.
Cook, Gerard College of Pennsylvania, bringing it home strong.
For 200 years, scientists poked and prodded, measured and mapped the human body, searching for a biological basis to race. Some measured facial angle to illustrate the proximity of races to the primitive. Others calibrated skull size to identify those with superior or inferior intelligence. Measures of eye shape, hair form, even brain color were scrutinized in the hunt for the fundamental sources of racial difference.
If we just take African Americans as an example, there's not a single body part that hasn't been subjected to this kind of analysis. You'll find articles in the medical literature about the Negro ear, and the Negro nose, and the Negro leg, and the Negro heart, and the Negro eye, and the Negro foot, and it's every single body part. And they're constantly looking for some organ that might be so fundamentally different in size and character that you can say this is something specific to the Negro versus whites and other groups. Scientists are part of their social context. Their ideas about what race is are not simply scientific ones, are not simply driven by the data that they're working with. That it's also informed by the societies in which they live.
At the turn of the 20th century, American society was riding a wave of confidence as an emerging industrial power. And the face of its power and prosperity was white. African Americans lived under the yoke of Jim Crow segregation. Most surviving Native Americans had been banished to reservations, and new immigrants crowded into urban ghettos. Disease was rampant. Death rates soared. Infant mortality was high. To many, this reflected a preordained natural order.
Those that looked wanted to confirm what they saw, which is to say that the proper place of, say, the Negro, or in other regions of the country, the Native American or the Chinese, were at the bottom of the social and political hierarchy. And if you can say that they are fundamentally biologically different, then they should be. Then it's natural for them to be at the bottom of our social hierarchy.